Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of Outercurve, which is Microsoft's open source foundation. And I've been doing this since about September. This is actually the first time that I didn't have somebody audibly laugh when I said Microsoft's open source foundation. So either you guys are incredibly polite, maybe it's an Upper East Coast thing. I've been doing it since September. The foundation itself was founded a couple of years ago by a guy named Sam Ramji. And it was founded specifically because within Microsoft, of course, there's famously been very, very long feelings toward open source from some camps within the company, most of them, frankly, on the sales side. But within the engineering side of the house, there has also been a very, very long understanding of the need for the company over some long cycle to fully embrace open source practices and technologies. And it's well understood within the engineering side of the house that one simply cannot run a company, a technology company, in the 21st century without a clear and obvious dependency on open source technologies. And frankly, if you're a company the size of Microsoft or anything with more than 12 people, if you're going to be absorbing open source technologies, it is in your best interest to be contributing back. And so it's pretty much the reason that Outercurve was founded. That doesn't mean that Outercurve is always fully embraced internally. And one of the reasons that I was picked for the role is that I'm very comfortable walking around Microsoft and knocking on people's doors and sometimes having quiet conversations and sometimes having loud conversations. But I do this with an understanding that at the end of the day, one cannot run a large technology company without really understanding not only the debt you have to open source, but your dependencies, your utter and absolute dependencies on open source technologies. So I came in about 3 months ago and I was told, hey, let's go ahead and let's figure out a way. We've had this open source foundation going along. It's done a couple of interesting things, and let's figure out a way to really make this interesting and useful for the rest of the industry. And one of the things that I did when I came in was I looked at the DNA of Outercurve, and the DNA of Outercurve is essentially Microsoft. And when you work in a company the size of Microsoft, going on 100,000 people right now, one of the trickiest things to do is figure out how to make the size of that company work for you. So there was a guy that I used to work for. His name's Mike Tutangi. I don't know if any of you guys know who he is. He was the very first architect on .NET. He was the guy who conceptualized .NET and built it up to .NET. And when you've done something like that within Microsoft, you attain a role called Technical Fellow. And Technical Fellow pretty much means that you can go around and you can say and do whatever it is you need to do to get things done, because you've already proven that you're pretty much the smartest person in the room and you can get stuff done. It's a get out of jail free card. And Mike used to tell me, figure out how to make the size of this company work for you. Other people used to say to me when I was at Microsoft, figure out how to make Microsoft act like a startup. And when I first had Mike telling me that, I internalized that to be, figure out how to make this place work like a startup. And you cannot get a company that big to act like a startup. How many of you guys have worked in startups? By the way, I use gender neutral guys. Okay, how many of you guys are going to work in startups? Okay, how many of you guys are going to work in big companies? Okay, so I've done a mixture of both. So usually in a startup, you think fast, and you iterate fast, and you move fast, and you use open source stuff, and you sometimes contribute against it, and sometimes you're thorough in reading the licenses, and sometimes you're not. And in a big company, a lot of times people get frustrated with how big the machinery is, just getting that gigantic maw to operate. What I finally understood Mike to be explaining to me was, figure out how to make the size of this place work. When you're working in a place that big, and you're bringing that many resources to bear, you can only take on problems of a certain size and a certain scale. You simply cannot tackle small startup scale problems because it's not economically efficient to tackle them. Does that make sense for folks? Okay. So this is sort of the basis of what I'm hoping to talk to you guys about. So when I started working at Outercurve, I realized that Outercurve is different than other open source foundations, except maybe Eclipse, and we can talk about that. But that it's really only worth Outercurve being out there as a separate third-party open source foundation if we're taking on large technical problems that are worth bringing to bear the resources of an Outercurve, are worth bringing to bear the scale of a Microsoft behind them. So what I've spent the last couple months doing is identifying where those problems are in open source that are of a scale that they're interesting and useful to be solved by Outercurve. So I've been doing a series of design reviews. I was doing them all day in the city yesterday. I'll be doing more of them later this week. And specifically what I want to talk to you guys about is something that I was thinking about on the train on the way up here. And I'll begin to outline this a little bit. I'm going to go through some history really quickly, and then I'll get to the specific problem. So if you are, let's see. So we all know what an operating system is, right? It basically abstracts out the complexity of developing. It used to be at the meta level. Now it's effectively at the cloud level. I think you guys get that better than most people. And allows developers to focus on applications. So if you look at the current existing dominant set of operating systems, they've all basically evolved from the same time and same place. Was anybody here born before 1990? Just so I know what I'm working with. Awesome. Two of us. All right, so Unix. Unix was born in 1969, same year as me, by the way. It's got a monolithic kernel. You guys are all familiar with that. The default UI was a command line interface. You guys are all familiar with that. And the problem that Unix solved for developers is that it made it easy for the kernel was handling the file system. Everything was nicely partitioned. There were low-level tasks were used commonly across programs that identified those lowest common denominators. And it abstracted all of that out so that if you wanted to develop an application, you didn't have to worry about all of that too. It was developed, by the way, for the GE 645 mainframe. And you guys are well aware that that mainframe basically would take up half this room. Unix was successful because a lot of developers have direct interaction. It took off as an operating system. This becomes important in a moment. When it came out from under the thumb of IBM and DEC, when AT&T started getting it away for free. It was also easy to adopt and adapt and move to different machines other than the machine, the incredible machine that was initially built for. It was ported from assembly. You guys are all familiar with assembly, right? Awesome. It was ported from assembly to C, which means that it made it accessible to a much larger pool of developers that could handle assembly. And it established the lowest common denominator by treating all kinds of files as simple byte arrays. This was magical at the time. I know that for you guys now, this is like, it's just part of your DNA. This was at the time magical. Linux came along in 1991, monolithic kernel, same as Unix, had many, many default UIs, have evolved through the years. And GNU Linux, and it's important to call out that I'm going to refer to it as GNU Linux because it was birthed in GNU. GNU Linux was created with the goal of developing a complete Unix-compatible software system, so compatible with the dominant OS at the time, but one that was entirely free and open source. Incidentally, this was developed for personal computing. And the reason I bring that out is because when we kind of come back to the problem in a couple minutes, and I want you guys to think about the context of the devices that were common within the consumer ecosystem at the time are important. All right, Linux success was due primarily to the fact that it had a free license and it was open source. And you could argue, about some of the niceties around that, but that's effectively why it beat out Unix. Let's move on to MS-DOS and Windows. So MS-DOS and Windows made a set of people an enormous amount of money, still making an enormous amount of money today. And it was designed to solve a different problem. It was created as a response to the increased interest amongst consumers for graphic UIs and for the desire amongst consumers that they could run a couple of applications on their desktop at the same time. We all take this right now for granted, but there was a period of time when the fact that you could open Word and open Excel at the same time on the same machine was amazing. Blew people away. And that's what Windows did. And Windows made it easy for developers to create this class of applications, consumer-facing applications and business applications, without having to think about partitioning, without having to think about memory, without having to think about the fact that suddenly they weren't bound simply by the memory that was available and easily accessed within the machine, but they could trust the machine, the operating system, to make decisions and performance trade-offs on behalf of that application to make sure that application worked better. And Windows was notably closed source. One of the things that I've been talking to people about the last couple of days, and this is where I'm interested in getting feedback from you guys particularly, is that all of these operating systems were developed in a period of time when you were bound by the limitations of what you could do with that machine in front of you. Whether the machine is that giant GE 645, or whether that machine is a PC, or even frankly, whether that machine is a Mac. But you guys are going out into a world today where the complexity to be resolved is not how do you make sure that that machine in front of you is able to handle a relatively complex application like the very first version of DOS. You guys are walking out into a world today where the challenge that you're dealing with is how you reduce the complexity of the user in a world where what the user is dealing with is not that $100 machine, but $110 machines. How do you deal with an environment in which the complexity comes from resolving access to all sorts of cloud-based systems across all sorts of participants in the entire computing ecosystem? What do you do when the computational load can be distributed out to a cloud instead of happening on a user's desktop? And what do you do when the algorithms that can make sense and really take advantage of the leverage of that computational load are giving you some localized information available on the device level, but also taking advantage of a full array of real-time and long-term data that's available on either one cloud or multiple clouds? Does this make sense for you guys? So what I'm trying to understand is, how do you go ahead and develop that? My next thesis, and I'll skip to these slides relatively quickly, is that this sort of next generation operating system, next generation set of operating systems, can only be developed open source. If you go back over the history of operating systems, there have been a couple of times when operating systems have been developed and they've been closed, and they've made some relatively small set of people an enormous amount of money for some discretely bounded length of time in a cycle. Does that make sense? If you're Apple and you're able to figure out how to develop the iOS operating system and you're able to develop the hardware and you get those first couple of crumbly little media relationships, you can make an enormous amount of money. But that only brings some advantages to the larger community. If today you were going to go out and you were going to build something as big as an operating system that everybody can take advantage of, you're going to open source it. And you're going to do so with an expectation that somebody's going to try to figure out how to make money from that operating system. It's probably not going to be the original contributors to this magical next generation operating system. Does this make sense? So what framed this for me today, and what framed the way that I was going to talk about it, I'm going to skip forward here, proposing theory. We'll talk about that if you want to later. And I'm actually going to skip off this. I'm going to talk about the announcement today made by Google around Android. Has anybody seen this yet? So this morning, Google announced that for anybody who wants to use Android going forward, in order to access the full array of Google Web Services, they have the user of the Android operating system has to be using the most recent version. In other words, from a practical perspective, this means if you're Samsung, you can no longer fork a version of Android and expect to be able to access Google Maps on that phone. If you don't adopt Google's operating system wholesale, then you don't get access to the array of services that they offer. And this is some people can see this as a very ham-handed response. Some people can see this, are you looking surprised or are you looking thoughtful back there?
That's crazy.
My response
That's
exactly.
a huge change.
But
yes.
That's also, I don't think, so there's two Google Cloud services. There's
We're
web
just going to skip
services
to
and
the
there's Android
conversation because this is
services.
what I want to ask about. Yeah, keep going.
Right, and so I think, I don't know anything about this, to be fair. I've read like 3 articles online.
Think with your mouth wide open. We're all here.
But, so the point is, on actual Android, there's 2 components, right? There's the Android, like stuff you actually install, and then there's the Android apps that talk to Google Cloud services. And that's the Google platform, it's AOSP, I think. No, the Android Assistant platform is AOSP, and then there's a Google part of it.
Google
yeah, Play
services.
services.
Thank you.
And you actually have to get permission from Google to install those on your app. And so
But
what
they're
they
now
just,
saying you have to use both.
oh, really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
So it seems like they teased everyone with this open source thing. Now they're just taking it.
Well, they didn't tease everybody with this open source thing. What they happened was actually somewhat more interesting. By the way, is this a useful conversation? I sort of jumped in without taking temperature. Right, great, we're going to continue forward. What happened was, they're like, you know, we want to go ahead, and we know that there's all these mobile devices coming out. And the problem that Android was trying to resolve, everybody tries to resolve the problem with the operating system. Android was trying, the original Rubin team was trying to resolve the problem of how do we take advantage of the fact that people are going to be on mobile devices and we're going to know their location. That was it. Like, how do we take advantage of that piece of hardware as opposed to the GB645? So like, we're going to develop this thing called Android. The Google team's like, hey, the whole world's moving to mobile. Windows is totally failing with that Windows Mobile OS. We don't even care if we win. We just want Windows to lose. Like, that's what that was all about. This was pre-iOS. But now we're like, wait a minute, Windows totally lost. But now these Apple guys have made a fortune, and there's 1 billion adopted Android operating systems out there, and we're not making jack from that. Like, how do we rein that back in? So I don't think there was ever an intent to tease. It's now more like, well, how do we make money from this? This is crazy that this is out there, we're not making money. And that's sort of the paradox, right, of open source and developing an open source operating system. One, I think, can safely assume that one cannot develop this next generating operating system that we were talking about without making sure that it's open source, anybody can access it, anybody can make pull requests, anybody can go ahead and fork it if they need to. But the trick is, how do you make money from that? And is it important to make money for that? For some people, it is never going to be important to make money from that. But for other people, it is going to be important to make money. Which may be a problem that you guys are interested in solving as engineers, or it may not be a problem that you're interested in solving as engineers. So there's this whole little section of slides that we skipped over here called Cozy and Theory. Who knows what Cozy and Theory is? Richard Coase. He just died like 6 months ago. All right, I'll spend like 45 seconds to a minute and a half here, and then if this is interesting, I can keep going. I built this in the middle of my deck because one of the arguments I'm making is that you cannot build this next generation operating system without making it wholly, completely open source from the beginning. Cozy and theorem is a theorem that says that for any large project, there's going to be a certain amount of friction associated with that project. And so if you're a large company and you want to build an enormous engineering team to build an operating system, you better plan on making enough money over the long term to pay for the friction associated with that. The project managers, the product managers, and the salespeople, and the swanky trips to wherever that you take your developers to when you want to excite them. And there's a friction associated with that. If you are building an operating system today and you plan to make a lot of money with it, you have to accept that that friction is going to come along with it. If you really think through the implications of Cozy and theorem then as applied to software development, what you're getting to is a point where you're saying that the engineers aren't the friction. The engineers are sort of a byproduct of it, but the friction comes with realizing the value associated with what the engineers built. So if you want to partake in the value associated with what engineers built, you want to solve both problems. You want to get access to the code, the product that's valuable, but you also want to get access to the distribution channel. And you want to have some control over that distribution channel in order to realize the money associated with it. And that is what Google is doing today. Google is saying, well, hey, we need now to get some control. We need to win back some control over this ecosystem that we're building. It's not a particularly elegant way that they're doing it, but it's not necessarily an effective way if you're doing it either. If you're sitting at Samsung this afternoon, right now, you're in a conference call that was not on your calendar at 8 o'clock this morning, and you're trying to figure out, how are we going to make money from this? Make sense? Questions? That was sort of whirlwind. I kind of compressed some stuff there, so hit me up. Yes, you had your hand up first.
Why don't you make Windows 9 open source?
Yeah.
Just for all the vendors who are locked in and just deny everybody else. So it's still open source partially, but it's only for your vendors who are locked in.
It's such an interesting question. So, and here I speak entirely as me as an individual, and secondarily I speak as someone at Outercurve, and I do not in any way, shape, or form in the next couple of minutes speak for anyone at Microsoft. Okay. They're familiar with this. They knew what they were getting. If you are running a company of, say, 95,000 people, and all these people are deeply invested in their jobs and in the infrastructure that you've built up, and frankly in the benefits that are accruing to you as a company for having invested so long in Windows, not even simply writing that initial code, but in ensuring at every step of the way, for example, that there's backwards compatibility with nearly every operating system that's come before it. That the entire ecosystem of developers that have bet their careers on you for the last 10, 15, 20 years have a place to go and understand how things are working. It's a tricky question. You have to think about at what point do we engage in a level of disruption to our core business, to a business that has sustained hundreds of millions of dollars worth of revenue for startups and big companies and service providers over the last 10, 15 years? And is there a way to do it elegantly that doesn't lead to disruption in that ecosystem, but allows those people to take part in this new set of value creation that's likely to be seen in the development of a next generation operating system? Does that make sense? I mean, if you're the if you're Satya, you're like, this is what you're thinking about tonight at dinner, you know? I mean, it's one of many things you're thinking about, but it's something that you're thinking about. You had a question over here.
Actually, I have two. The first one is that, are you going to do anything about Microsoft patent trolling of like open source firms? Because like Microsoft has a large amount of patents, and some of them are actually very interesting, like robust Byzantine packages, but they're typically covered. There's a lot of outcomes and a lot of cool stuff Microsoft research, but they're typically covered by patents all over the place, and it's always extremely risky to choose those, especially given that there have been lawsuits before, and I mean, Microsoft makes a large amount of money off Android licensing.
Yep.
Are you going to be able to provide cover for that, or is that sort of out of your control?
Well, let me go ahead and put this back to you this way. So my last job before I did this one was head of open source at AOL. So some of you chuckled, you got what that meant. If you're working in a company, particularly a publicly traded company, so if you're working in a publicly traded company, you have an obligation at every turn to make sure that you're protecting the value that's been created there on behalf of the shareholders who are taking part in this long-term bet with you on the direction of that company. And for better or for worse, one of the most effective ways right now that you can ensure your ability to be competitive in a cutthroat ecosystem is to think about how you wield your patents. And sometimes you wield them as a cudgel, and sometimes you wield them as a much more precise tool. But it's very difficult right now, if you're in a really big company, to ignore the value of those patents. Even if you guys have all studied game theory at this point, right? At least you've read some limited amount of game theory. You cannot be in an environment where you're not, you can't be in an environment where other people are going to be coming after you with patents and simply decide we're going to give up our patents and give up access to them and make them free and open for everybody. The cost to sustaining that larger corporate entity is so great over such a relatively short period of time that if your real battle is to make sure that over a much longer period of time, you're bringing to market great products for consumers, and you can safely assume that there are people within Microsoft who are there to do that, then one of the devil's bargains you're making right now within the industry is having to engage in some form of patent war.
So that's a no?
Oh, I can't do a thing about it. I'm like one person and there's 100,000 over there, you know?
The second is, where did you source the Google announcement?
I'll send you the link. I'll send everybody the link afterwards.
Because I found
Can
it
send
on
that to you?
Android Police, and it's a rumor, and they say they'll force new devices that want to get GMS, which is the Google mobile platform, so all their apps, Google Play, that sort of thing,
Yep.
to use a version of Android that's been released in the last year.
Yes. The industry is very small. And particularly if you're on the West Coast, and if you're spending a lot of time in the Upper West Coast, or you're spending a lot of time with, I travel a lot, you're spending a lot of time in California, spending a lot of time in New York, you're having enough conversations that at some point you're just waiting for those conversations to become public. There was that link, there's another link as well to the announcement that they made earlier today. But I think that everybody's it's fairly well understood that that's the direction that Android is certainly likely to go, if not already completely gone.
Wouldn't they have to relicense Android if they actually made that requirement?
Well, this is GMS, not AOS.
Well, no, but like if they actually made a requirement that you have to have a certain version of Android or you have to have both bundled together, wouldn't they have to relicense that Android open source?
Yes, if you are releasing a device right now, and you're planning on building out an Android device right now, your choice would either be to sign up a new license or completely develop from scratch your own mobile operating system. There's just not a lot of options there. It's the practical reality.
You were talking about licensing in the code, right? Not buying a license from Google.
So,
You
were
can
saying
go ahead and you can forge an earlier version. You can use
Right.
an earlier version of the code under an existing license. Correct.
my point is that I think it would be very difficult for them to relicense all of Android, considering how many contributors there have been at this point.
It would be. But at some point in time, so let's look at the Kindle. That's a great example right there. Obviously, the Amazon team's not going to go suddenly right now and change their version or sign a whole new license, nor do they have to. They've already built up their devices. They've already made enough contributions to their own version of that operating system that they don't have that dependency anymore. But it does have some interesting implications for the ecosystem at large and for what can be determined over time to be part of an operating system and part of what's covered by a license and part of what any given developer is signing up for in developing new applications on top of that. You had a question?
Yeah, there's another, I mean, it's interesting because if Google takes it to the extreme of just like, you have to use the version of Android we're pushing out, or you can't have access to GNS, it might see it might backfire. I mean, there might be a bunch of competitors that can now spring up on other devices or other Android versions or forked Android versions. I mean, like Cyanogen mod, which is like a mod on Android, this is custom ROM. They probably wouldn't be allowed to use GNS in this scenario.
Probably not.
Yeah, I remember that being a problem a while back. And what it comes down to is like, there's alternatives to Google Maps, there's alternatives to all sorts of Google Hangouts, Voice, Gmail, all that sort of stuff, Play Store too. And it could backfire on Google, that they could actually be opening up a bigger market.
And that's the bet that you're making.
Yeah.
So one of the things that often happens right now is that people tend to assume that open source is simply a mechanism by which code can be written or contributed to. And what's overlooked there are the product implications of using open source technology and making a decision to use open source technologies as the basis of the product. So if you go into a lot of technology companies right now and you ask product managers, okay, what is open source? And I did this a couple weeks ago because I was curious how mature the understanding's gotten. A lot of product managers will come back and say something like, well, I think it's got something to do with Linux. And that, sorry, somebody over there laughed really hard and totally made me laugh. Well, I think it has something to do with Linux. I'm like, yeah. The complexities associated with using open source software or making a decision to build your business around the development of open source software are far-ranging at this point. They go well beyond the licensing issues associated with various pieces of software. And they go squarely into the long-term strategic engagement you expect to have around your product. If you're a company like Sugar CRM, everybody inside Sugar CRM fully understands the implications of that. But most people don't. And as you guys go out there and you go past your degrees and you go out into the workforce, particularly those of you who raise your hands about working in big companies, this is something that you're going to run into over and over again, is the practical application and practical impacts of having built open source software. I think these are wholly surmountable issues, by the way. And I think there are excellent models out there to suggest that how companies build businesses on top of open source projects is going to change dramatically over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I don't think that anybody 20 years from now is going to be in a position, and I can be totally wrong about this, of having built a 30,000 person, having invested in a 30,000 person engineering team that they own and a piece of closed source open operating system software that they expect to completely maintain control over. There's going to have to be some sort of semi-permeable membrane over it. There's an example I can give you of how technology has changed how business teams around products have worked over the last couple of years. If you go back even 10 years ago, most relationships between engineering teams were crafted by business development people. If you wanted to have access to somebody else's project, you didn't simply sign up to use their API. You had to call your business dev person, and they called their biz dev counterpart, and a negotiation was reached, and everybody moved forward happily. At this point in time, most engineers don't do that. They either find an open API, or they find an API that they can sign up for really quickly, and if they have to go through the biz dev person, they find another way to get the project built. And we're seeing the same sort of shift happening with open source software as well. There would have been no expectation 15 years ago that you could just go out and find a piece of software that met your needs or act as the fundamental basis of your product. You would have been forced to write from scratch, and that's just not what happens. Yes?
You mentioned that you're looking at the future of Windows or future of operating systems in general as more of an open source thing in the cloud, not necessarily with your one computer or likewise limited to one licensing system. And then you mentioned that you're privy to conversations that happened before most people know them. And then you talked about opening up operating systems and you don't think they're going to be closed anymore. Are you involved with Windows 9?
No. So one of the things that I'm super clear about, so in order for me to maintain credibility, when I go out and I engage with open source communities, I have to have a distance between myself and Microsoft and any teams at Microsoft. I'm a wholly third-party, I'm a wholly funded third-party foundation. There actually is another open source project within Microsoft called the Open Technologies Group. They're a great group. They're a fully funded subsidiary. I'm a wholly separate foundation. And that's just not it's not a wall I cross over. I read the same thing all of you guys read, and I have, access to the same published papers that everybody else has access to. This is just purely and simply the work of Outercurve itself. And as we think about just from a research perspective, what does it mean to move in this new world? Where would we place? If you're a foundation and you're looking at placing your bets over the next 20, 25, 50 years, you're not going to place those bets on operating systems that are dependent on PC, for example. Make sense? Yes?
Yes, so this is my question. It seems like, I think your department is still part of the Microsoft company. So is it going to happen like one day, like someone look at your research program and say, this is the thing that can make big money, we can make it like no longer open source? Is that going to happen? Seems like, I think the main goal, or like at least one of the main goals of the company is to make money.
The main goal of any company is to make money. If once you've taken on investors, if you're a startup with 3 investors, or if you're a publicly traded company with public investors, the object of that company is generally to make money, except Amazon. That's a whole other story, right? I would make the argument that if you were standing inside a software company right now, whether it's Microsoft or whether it's Google or Apple or IBM or anywhere else, and you're saying, no, we're going to build this, it's going to be closed source, we're going to curtail access to the code, we're going to make serious restrictions on how people can use the code or any previous version of the code, you're betting against history. Betting against history is never a good place to be. Does that make sense? I could be totally wrong, but I think you'd be betting against the side of history right now. And you guys are all open source people, presumably. I suspect you're probably in the camp of this is the direction history's going, or this is how you'd be spending your time. Do you want to think about it? Let's see if there's any other questions. Any other questions? Yes.
I think what Microsoft can do is open source more stuff. What they can do is they can create these certifications or, rack maybe a very good entry for you and increase your brand and make it more competitive. And you can associate Microsoft with open source, but you'll still make money through these certifications and this extra level of teaching that will align the open source community with Microsoft's interests. So,
Yes, so that's a corollary bet to the bet that IBM made in the 90s, right? So in the 90s, IBM said, well, the way we've made money all these years isn't going to be working for us going forward. We're going to turn into a professional services company. One could make the argument that one of the biggest benefits that Microsoft brings to the development community is in MSDN, is in access to libraries, is in access to documentation on how to build sample stacks, is in access to implementation documentation. If one assumes that that is a place that a company can make money, then you could build an open source operating system from scratch, and you could build up that entire ecosystem around it. And that would be valuable in and of itself, independent from the operating system. It's almost inevitable that those sorts of services companies are going to rise around any major open source project that develops right now. Node.js is a really great example. The people making the money right now are not the folks over at Join. The people making the money right now are the people who've developed tools and experiences that surround the Node experience. Does that make sense?
makes sense.
So you all want to be consultants. Not really. For a variety of very good reasons, it's probably not the path you want to go down. If you're in engineering, you like to build stuff, not talk about theoretically building stuff. Other questions? Was this useful for folks? Raise your hands. Good, thank you. Is there anything else that I should follow up with for people that would be additionally useful? Yes.
This is probably just a small detail, but you mentioned that the original machine that Unix was developed on was VE something?
I believe it was the GE 645.
I seem to recall hearing that it was like PDP either 7 or PDP 11. I don't recall exactly which.
You could very well be right, and I'm more than happy to go back and look at footnotes for you. Before I speak to things specifically, I try and go back and look at original documentation, which I did this afternoon, but that doesn't mean that I'm wholly completely right. And one of the advantages of working collaboratively is you can always go back and check it. More than happy to look that up with you offline. Yeah. It's ascribed, it's popularly ascribed, the GE 645, but that could perhaps be wrong. Yes?
Wikipedia says you're right, so you're right.
That's basically a bar bet, right? We can go bet down the bar. I like thinking of Neil's step down the bar. Anybody else? Thank you very much for your time.